各位，在西方主流叙事中，中国与俄罗斯常被描述为天然的盟友，仿佛两国之间存在牢不可破的信任和价值同盟。但这判断的本身恰恰低估了现实中的张力与互疑。法国长期研究中国经济与创新体系的分析家肖恩·雷因指出，中俄的关系更像是一种在外部压力下形成的深层性靠拢，而非深层制度互信的结果。真正将两国推向彼此的，并不是意识形态的亲近，而是来自于美国与北约体系的持续施压、制裁、技术封锁、高端产业出口的管制，形成了一条清晰的压力曲线。从俄罗斯到中国，外部世界正在反复释放出一种信号，那就是现有的秩序并不打算为这些国家提供安全的缓冲。正是在这一种背景下，中国的战略选择开始发生系统性转变。从第一轮的贸易战以来，自力更生不再是口号，而成为跨产业、跨地区的真实行动。从半导体、人工智能到粮食、能源、农业，中国开始主动切断单点依赖。牛肉不再只是来自南美，大豆不只是来自单一国家，蓝莓、海鲜、畜牧业在国内迅速被复制与扩张。这不是效率最优解，但明显是安全优先的选择。这一逻辑在技术领域尤为明显。围绕人工智能与半导体的博弈，被视为未来权力结构的核心。外部管制越严，内部投资就越集中。国产替代并非一夜之间完成，但工业能力、资本规模与政策动员形成了独特的组合。当外界仍以时间差来评估中国技术的进展，那么新的模型、平台、生态已经在本土形成，并迅速商业化。这一种变化让不少的西方观察者感到意外，甚至不安。长期以来，对中国的判断往往停留在旧有印象之中，忽视了工程师数量、教育体系和产业链完整度带来的积累效应。中国并非依赖单点突破，而是通过规模化改进和系统集成，缩短了整个追赶的路径。而与此同时，投资与资本流向的变化正在制造新的错位。一些国家的政治限制，使得本国投资者被迫退出中国科技板块，而其他国家的长期资金却得以进入。这并不改变技术进步的方向，却重塑了收益的归属。在制造业与消费领域，这一种变化变得可见。新能源汽车、智能终端和平台型应用正在东南亚和新兴市场迅速占位。许多传统品牌并未被补贴击败，而是在认知与组织层面严重滞后。对于当地技术生态的忽视，还有对用户需求变化的误判，使得他们在关键窗口期错失转型。而所有这一些转型，最终会指向一个被低估的事实，那就是中国经济不再依赖对美出口，其增长的结构正在向内循环与多元化外循环并行转变。所以出口占比下降，并未削弱整体的韧性，反而降低了单一市场胁迫的风险。这也解释了为何贸易战的威慑效应持续在减弱。可替代性、可转移性、可自建的能力，使得威胁难以形成决定性的打击。增长不再高速，却更稳定；信心经历波动，却并未崩塌。在新的一轮世界秩序重塑中，低估中国的代价正在不断的积累。所以问题并不在于谁能赢一场短期的对抗，而是在于谁更能准确地理解结构变化的本身。让我们看一下视频。
China, in my mind, actually is more of a natural partner with the United States than even Russia. I think that in the Western world, they view that China and Russia are best friends stuck at the hip. I actually think there's a lot of mistrust there, but these two countries have come together as a matter of survival because they feel that the United States and NATO are trying to destabilize China, contain it, and you've seen it. right? You've seen it with Joe Biden putting on economic sanctions, as well as export controls on high-tech industry. You've seen it with Trump threatening now with Venezuela, and now he's the acting president of Venezuela. There's a question whether or not he will allow the Venezuelans to continue to sell oil to the Chinese. So the Chinese, about 4% of their overall oil comes from Venezuela. So that would be a real hit on them. So the question, Glenn, is what should China do? And so starting during the Trump first administration, they decided to focus on indigenous innovation and self-reliance. So it's not just semiconductors, it's not just AI, it's everything. So, China buys a lot of beef from Brazil and Argentina. Now they're focused on building up their cattle herds in Shandong province. They've been buying a lot of soybeans from Brazil. Now they're looking for alternative sources. Instead of buying blueberries and seafood from Australia, you now see that China's building up huge blueberry, strawberry plantations or fields in Yunnan province. So to answer your question, the first thing is really, unfortunately for Western companies, the reality is that Chinese companies are starting to focus on self-reliance because there's a fear that the Western world will sanction China the way that they sanction Russia, and then they'll never be able to get access to products. So again, beef, blueberries, but even more importantly, Glenn, is technology. What we've seen in the future world is that whoever controls AI, whoever controls semiconductors and sets the tech stack and technology standards is going to be enormously powerful. And if Trump, if Biden, the next president, if they continue to put export controls on NVIDIA chips, then that's going to destroy the Chinese economy. So the best place to invest right now is in Chinese technology. And you see companies like Minimax, like Cabricom. These are the Chinese versions of NVIDIA. And here's the thing. You look at somebody like Eric Schmidt or Sam Altman, right? Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI a year and a half ago, said that China was 10 years behind the US when it comes to AI. Eric Schmidt, who is the former CEO of Google, said China was 2-3 years behind. And pretty much after saying that, Glenn, DeepSeek came out. And you've seen Alibaba, you've seen Baidu, you've seen tons of Chinese companies have been emerging with technology, which took these guys by surprise because, again, they're getting information from China watchers who haven't been to China in 10 years. And so, I love America. I'm American. I don't want to see America hurt. I don't want to see China hurt. But in order for America to do well, they can't underestimate China's innovation capabilities. Now, that's great for investors if you're allowed to invest. Now, what's happened under the United States is they've banned a lot of private equity and some mutual fund investors from buying into these Chinese tech stocks. So you're going to lose money out if you're an American investor. That's a great opportunity for Norge Bank, for you guys up in Norway that might not have the same political constraints. And you could invest in Chinese indigenous innovation. 2014 called the end of copycat China. And I predicted that China would become an innovation powerhouse. And Silicon Valley laughed at me. I mean, I got pilloried in the press by the Silicon Valley types. Here's the thing. China has the capital, it has the government support, it has the ecosystem, and importantly, has the engineers. So it's going to catch up, if not surpass the United States in a lot of different technologies. Now, what happens in America is, to their credit, the Americans have more venture capital. It's very, not easy, but if you have a great idea, you can raise seed capital. It's not so easy in China. You don't have that innovation VC Silicon Valley or Austin, Texas atmosphere. What China is very good at is not inventing, but taking something that the Americans did early and then throwing tons of money at it, tons of engineering, and improving on it. It used to be business model innovation. Now it's actually technology innovation, but they're catching up very quick. And if you look at it, Nature magazine just published recently the top, tech and AI universities in the world, and almost all of them are coming from mainland China right now. I think a degree from Zhejiang University or Tsinghua is going to be more valuable than a degree from Harvard or MIT in 10 years, because China's really changing the curriculum in schools while the United States still deals with the tenure. Like I went to Harvard and some of my professors are still there, 25, 30 years later, and they're just peddling the same misinformation on China and in technology today. And if you go to Singapore, BYD has replaced Toyota and BMW as the biggest seller of autos in Singapore. And I just got in from Thailand last night when I booked a premium car on Grab, which is the Thai or Southeast Asia version of Uber. I expected to get a Toyota. Instead, I got a BYD. So even the Thais are viewing BYD as a premium company right now. And I think, again, there's been a lot of criticism that this is about subsidies, and that the Chinese government is using unfair advantages. But here's the thing. When you look at Tesla and SpaceX, and, Elon Musk is a great revolutionary innovator, but if it wasn't for subsidies from the US government, there would be no Tesla. So I think one of the problems is America, especially, they criticize China for things, whether it be subsidies, whether it be military deterrence, whatever it is, but it's actually very similar to what the Americans do. It might even be the Americans do it a million times worse when it comes to subsidies and economic coercion. And I think you have to look at the German and the American automakers for not listening to their teams on the ground to understand how fast NEVs were taking place. It's not like they didn't have warning. I'll give two examples, Glenn. Right before COVID hit, I met with the global CEO of one of Detroit's biggest CEO automakers. And I sat him down and I said, look, you need to be working with companies like Huawei and Alibaba and Tencent and try to create a technology ecosystem with your cars, because Chinese are going to view cars no longer as engineering marvels, but as mobile phones on wheels. And this global CEO had never heard of Alibaba, had never heard of Tencent. So imagine a Chinese company saying they've never heard of Google, never heard of Facebook. So this guy was woefully ignorant. The second part is I said Chinese are going to be adopting NEVs and technology. And this guy was paying me like 10,000 US an hour to talk. And our entire conversation went from NEVs to would Chinese want touchscreens in their cars? And should it be 9 inches, 11 inches, or 13 inches? So I was trying to warn this Detroit CEO, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and they were ignorant of it. And then Volkswagen was probably even more ignorant in a way, because during COVID, a lot of their executives, their German ones, were based here. And COVID was harsh. It was not easy to exist in China during COVID. And they had about 4 or 5 dozen executives who came here, couldn't handle it, and wanted to move back to Europe. Now, they were hired by the joint venture partners in China, which meant that if they quit and move back to Europe, they lose, I think, about a 50,000 euro bonus. But most importantly, they wouldn't have a job. The joint venture couldn't transfer them back to Volkswagen. So a lot of these guys were like, I'm going to quit, but I'm going to look for another job first. And so they spent a year and a half, not focused on Volkswagen in China, but focused on getting their families into the right schools, themselves getting the right jobs back in Europe. And that's why Volkswagen and Porsche have absolutely collapsed in China, right? Porsche sales have down 40%, from their highs. So it's not that China's doing unfair subsidies. It's that I think a lot of the Western brands are ignorant about what's happening on the ground, and they refuse to admit, like Elon Musk did 10 years ago, the fast speed of Chinese companies moving up the value chain in terms of quality. Well, I think, again, it's China had to do. Their back was against the wall. If they didn't do indigenous innovation, if you didn't focus on improving the education sector, then China would be contained and destabilized. And that's why, over the last 6, 7 years, Chinese, the wealthy 10%, they've had weak sentiment. Now, part of it is self-inflicted by the Chinese government that, they cracked down on Alibaba and Tencent. And I think that was a great thing. I have a whole chapter of this in my book, The Split, where the crackdown on technology was good because it created the opportunity for little dragons to emerge, like Douyin or Pinduoduo or Cabricom. I think the duopoly of Tencent and Alibaba was strangling innovation in the country for 10, 15 years. So the government was right to crack down on it, but they cut too far to the bone, and they didn't, frankly, explain themselves well, not only just to the international investing community, but also the local domestic business community. So I think Chinese have lost a lot of their animal spirits because of that. And then they were scared. They were scared that the United States under Biden was going to contain China the way that America has contained Cuba, Iran, North Korea for generations. And so Chinese, again, they have 20 million US in household savings, but they just weren't spending that money. They were keeping that money for a rainy day in case the geopolitical situation would continue to deteriorate. There's a real fear under Biden that no matter what China did, it was an ideological war. Liberal democracies versus communist authoritarian nations, the good guys versus the bad guys, cowboys versus Indians. And so these wealthy 10% of Chinese were quite concerned and didn't spend money. But what we've seen, Glenn, and this is why last January I turned more optimistic, was that you've seen green shoots in animal spirits. You've seen DeepSeek come out. You've seen Cabricon come out. You've seen Ne Zha 2, which is the best-selling movie of all time at, $2 billion. You're seeing that China in the last 6 to 12 months have finally been able to overcome some of those sanctions and export controls. It's not going to be easy. You're right. I'm not a China bull economically right now. You're not going to see 8-10% growth. It's not going to boom like it did in the 2010s, but the economy is stable. It's strong. There's pockets where one could invest and make money. And most importantly, it's far better than what a lot of people in the Western world think. And that's why China is winning the trade war against the United States, right? Like Scotty Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said that America has all the cards. But here's the thing, Glenn. Anything that America can make and sell to the Chinese can make on their own, like semiconductors, or they can buy elsewhere. So instead of buying American oil, they're buying oil from Canada. Instead of buying soybeans from America, they're buying from Brazil and Argentina. Instead of buying American beef, they're buying from Australia. So the second part is the overall amount of exports. China's not really an export-led economy anymore. It's more a domestic economy. So exports to China, from China to the US only account for about 2.5% of overall GDP. So this shock and awe strategy of Scotty Bessent and Trump in the trade war was misguided. It failed. Now, I know Scotty, not well, but I used to advise him when he was at Soros Capital. And the last time I spoke to him was 2012, 2013. And even at that point, he underestimated China. He said China is a communist nation and by default will collapse because it's communist. And so when you have ideologues like this that are leading the trade war, that are leading our economic foreign policy, and they don't have clear, strong, pragmatic, non-ideological analysis of China, they put us in the wrong direction. And that's why China is thriving right now, and the United States has failed in the trade war so far.